case that professional sports in America are closely tied to radical politics in his new book, What's My Name, Fool? Next, hear the stories of Olympic sprinter John Carlos and boxer Muhammad Ali, as well as former NFL player Pat Tillman, who joined the Army Rangers and was killed in Afghanistan. This is 45 Minutes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Barnes Noble Astor Place. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dave Zirin. Mr. Zirin is the editor of the Prince George's Post and writes a weekly column for the paper called Edge of Sports. He's the regular sports commentator for Air America's national radio show, On the Reel with Chuck D. And in addition, he's a senior writer at basketball.com and a regular columnist for Slam magazine. His journalism has appeared in The Source, the College Sporting News, the San Francisco Bay View, and Z Magazine, to name a few. And he joins us this evening to discuss his first book, What's My Name, Fool? Sports and Resistance in the United States. Mary Radcliffe, author of the San Francisco Bay View, has said of the author, he is that rarest of commodities in sports writing, an original voice. This book will be loved by both athletes and who hate politics and by activists who hate sports. So won't you please join me in welcoming Dave Zirin.
What's My Name, Fool? Sports and Resistance in the United States. Now, this book, just to make it clear in one sentence, is about times when radical politics found expression in the world of professional sports in the U.S. Now, just to be clear, I have heard some of the jokes about this book. Like, radical politics in U.S. sports, that'll make a great pamphlet. And why don't you just write about something that has a little bit more material to it, like the great atheists of the Christian Coalition or Strom Thurmond's favorite Black History moments. Now, but there is a tradition, and that's the case I make with this book, deeply hidden, of times when the struggles off the field exploded onto the field with absolutely electric consequences. Now, this tradition runs counter to the carnival of reaction that I think a lot of us see in sports who watch it on a day in, day out basis, whether that's for work or not, in this country. Now, I actually had a front row seat for this carnival of reaction just last month when I went to a Washington Nationals game. That's my home team. And I went because, big shock, I actually wanted to see a baseball game. But instead, what I was treated to was what the Nationals were calling Military Appreciation Night, or MAN, where 20 young men right there at the home plate, an emphasis on men, were sworn into the U.S. Marines before the start of the game. Now, this took place with George W. Bush sitting in one of the owner's boxes up top as, like Caesar, I kept waiting for lions to emerge from the dugout, as the announcer thanked Bush and the troops for fighting for our freedom in Iraq. And honestly, I sat there just slack-jawed, which is not my normal pose, just utterly speechless, not my normal mode of action, because, as fans, this is when the speechless part came, we were informed by that kind of disembodied God voice that comes from the speakers, that we too could sign up to fight for Operation Iraqi Freedom at a stand located right outside the stadium. Wow, peanuts, Cracker Jacks, and war. That is a great evening if I ever heard one. Now, if like me, you're one of the, 61% of the country who doesn't think that the troops in Iraq happen to be fighting for freedom right now, you find yourself in this stadium with absolutely no voice. You find yourself with no way to express yourself to the athletic industrial complex. And I was sitting there, and it just never ceases to amaze me how sports, something that had a huge role in shaping me growing up, something that was an incredibly positive influence on me growing up, that I believe should celebrate beauty and the best of competition and cooperation and fun, God forbid, can be used in such a disgusting way. Now, I love sports, and that's why I think we need to fight for sports. We need to actually reclaim them. We need to take sports back. And if we're going to do so, what we need to know our history. That's our greatest ammunition in this fight. We need to know our history of the athletes, the sports writers, and the fans who have stood up to the machine. If for no other reason then knowing this history, I think, allows us to look at the world and see that struggle can affect every aspect of life in this system, even the swoosh-adorned ivory tower known as sports. Now, I want to start here really by talking about where the title of this book comes from. And to be honest, I used to have a joke that clunked mightily when I would talk about the book, where I would say, "What's my name, fool? No, it's not a tribute to Mr. T," which only it had that kind of reaction. And but what occurred to me was I was actually at a bookstore a couple weeks ago when a young, well-meaning person came up to me and said, "Oh my God, is this the book about Mr. T?" and was totally serious. So I repeat that just to say that our history has been robbed from us, I think is a safe assessment. And I want to start, though, about where this title actually comes from, because I think it tells a great deal about the book, and it's also a direct reference to what I believe is the high point of that connection between sports and resistance, which in my view is the time when the heavyweight champion of the world had one foot in the black freedom struggle and one foot in the anti-war movement. And of course, I'm talking about the great Muhammad Ali. Now, today in 2005, I think people, especially people who are, say, under 30, know Ali most as sort of like the walking saint, the guy who lit the torch at the '96 Olympics in Atlanta, the guy who comes out to throw out the first pitch or toss the ball. And when you see this and you see presidents sort of pat him on the back and lead him by the hand, you just would never know that this was the most despised, slandered, brutalized, and also heroic athlete on the face of the earth in the 1960s. Now, Ali made everybody confront his politics of resistance when he changed his name. First from Cassius Clay to Cassius X, actually, and then, of course, to Muhammad Ali. And if we're going to talk about Ali, just to be very clear, everybody has to get Will Smith out of their heads, because it's just too upsetting to me to think that people, the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is moving on. Okay, now, there are really no words for the storm that this caused when Cassius Clay changed his name. I mean, the heavyweight champion of the world in this country in the 60s, when boxing was arguably the biggest sport in the United States, the champion was the symbol of Americana, red, white, and blue, strength, power, aggression, all of these things. And all of a sudden, you had the heavyweight champion of the world, first of all, talking about how pretty he was, which shocked people, in and of itself, but then joining the organization of Malcolm X, joining an organization in the Nation of Islam that unabashedly believed in self-defense for people fighting in the South in the Civil Rights Movement. And the mobbed-up, corrupt, right-wing fight world absolutely lost their minds. But what was incredible about that time was overnight, the name became so seminal to the 60s, because whether or not you called the champion Clay or Ali, it said everything about you. It said what side you were on in the black freedom struggle, what side you were on in the free speech movements breaking out on campuses, soon the war in Vietnam as well. It was an incredible thing. And just to give an idea about this, my step-aunt was telling me this story when I was showing her the book about how she actually moved out of her apartment for a week, where, living with her dad. She's 17 years old. She moved out and stayed on a friend's couch because she got in this huge fight with her dad about whether the heavyweight champion's name happened to be Clay or happened to be Ali. Now, you might think that this sounds like a pretty dysfunctional family, and you'd be right. But the bigger issue is that it was really not an argument about his name. It was an argument about the political period. It was an argument about the radicalization breaking out and which side of the barricades you might have seen yourself on. Now, this whole name controversy really reached its peak in November of 1965. That's when Ali fought a former two-time champion, a man who was proudly patriotic, named Floyd Patterson. Now, in the pre-fight hype, Patterson, this is what he said to reporters. This is a direct quote. He said, "This fight is a crusade to reclaim the title from the black Muslims. As a Catholic, I am fighting Clay. And yes, his name is Clay, as a patriotic duty to return the crown to America." Now, Ali's response to this just shocked reporters because he had no response at all. I mean, this was the man they called Louisville Lip, Gaseous Cassius, Cash the Brash, and he had nothing to say in response to this. He just let it simmer, and then he did his talking in the ring. 9 rounds against Patterson, he just took him apart, and as he was jabbing at Patterson, he yelled out so everyone in press row could hear. He said, "Come on, America, come on, white America, say my name. Is my name Clay? What's my name, fool?" And that's where I get the title of the book. And that's just the title, so it's a good book. Now, What's interesting as I'm talking to people about this book, I've had the privilege to go around and speak about it, is that most sports fans I talk to know Ali is the person responsible for saying, "What's my name, fool?" not Mr. T. And most know that it's in reference to his name change and religious conversion. But it's the background that people don't know, the swirling black freedom struggle, the symbolic and very personal importance Ali's fights had to people just figuring out how to stand up on their own. I mean, as Bryant Gumbel said, and I can't believe I'm quoting Bryant Gumbel, but it's a really good quote. He said, "One of the reasons the civil rights movement went forward was that black people were able to overcome their fear. And I honestly believe that for many black Americans, that came from watching Muhammad Ali. He simply refused to be afraid, and being that way, he gave other people courage." And another person, Julian Bond, who back then was a young civil rights activist, today he's one of the heads of the NAACP, he said, "The act of Ali joining the nation was not necessarily something we all agreed with, but we just loved the fact that he seemed to be telling white people to go to hell for us." Now, I want to give two examples of that sense, though, about Ali's actual presence, giving people confidence in the movements going on outside the ring that I think are very evocative and certainly not something we're taught in Sports Century moments on ESPN. The first is something that took place in Alabama, where you had a group of African-American activists in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, basically the youth wing of the civil rights movement. They were organizing a group there called the Lowndes County Freedom Party. They were trying to register the poorest of the poor African-American voters in Alabama, sharecroppers, people who worked in factories down there. And they're famous in the sort of the annals of the civil rights movement because they were the first people to ever use the symbol of a Black Panther. And Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in California, they used that as an inspiration to call themselves the Black Panthers. That's something people who know the history of the civil rights movement know. That, oh yeah, that's where they had the symbol of the Black Panther in Alabama. But what a lot of people don't know is that their slogan that they had emblazoned underneath the Black Panther was, "We are the greatest." I mean, they took the Ali, "I am the greatest," and put a big plural on the front of that. Another example is Martin Luther King, when he came out against the Vietnam War in 1967. This is something that's generally talked about with King in general discussion, but it's not remembered the degree of pressure and criticism he received for doing it at the time, not just from like the mainstream media, but also from the established civil rights movement who thought that King shouldn't be speaking out about international affairs of war. When King gave his first press conference to actually speak about the war in Vietnam, he said in his remarks, "Like Muhammad Ali tells us, we are all victims of the same system of injustice and oppression." Like incorporating Muhammad Ali's name to explain why he's coming out against the war. That to me is incredible. Now, I think these stories are incredible. I hope I'm not alone. But I think the problem is in sports history itself, as it's told on, the worldwide leader, ESPN, is that it gets marketed to death with the soft lighting, the bad music, the booyah, all that stuff. And like Ali, it becomes utterly sort of ESPN'd. It's like its political teeth just get extracted. And that's really what the book is about, is trying to reclaim that history and learn about the fire underneath the icons. And I want to give some examples of that, sort of like the history that we know and then the history that we're not told. Like, for example, it's well known that Jack Johnson was the first black heavyweight champion of the world, winning the title in 1908. But do we know that when he defended the title successfully against Jim Jeffords, who was called the Great White Hope, his defeat of Jeffords actually started the greatest race riot this country had ever seen and ever would see until the 1968 King assassination. The character of these riots were white mobs incensed at Johnson's victory, attempting to enter black neighborhoods and black communities defending themselves by force. After a boxing match, this occurred in 1910. I mean, and just to continue that, just to show how what happens off the field or out of the ring influences what's in the ring, Booker T. Washington, who was just outraged and incensed, conservative black leader at the time, went to Johnson and demanded that he condemn people for rioting. And Johnson said, "You can kiss my," I can't say that because it's on TV, but Johnson responded, "You can kiss my black ass," is what Johnson said in response. I just got the okay from C-SPAN. Okay. I mean, we may also know that baseball was segregated for 50 years until 1947. But do we know the story of Lester Red Rodney, who was the sports editor of the Communist Party's newspaper, The Daily Worker? I mean, a lot of people I talk to, their first response is, wow, the Daily Worker had a sports section. That's the first point of surprise. But that Lester Rodney used the sports section as an organizing center to fight for baseball's integration, a campaign that garnered over 1 million signatures collected at ballparks around the country, from Wrigley Field to Comiskey Park to Yankee Stadium out here in New York. Now, I got to interview Lester Rodney for this book, and it was an absolute privilege and something that I will never, ever forget. And 95 years old, sharp as a tack. I mean, we may know that Jackie Robinson was that man, the first one to integrate baseball in 1947, but I think we know him mostly as this kind of quiet, suffering black saint who was brought to the Dodgers under the sort of paternal warmth of Branch Rickey. Now, what we don't know him as is a person who wrote a political sports column for the New York Post, which dealt with the issues of civil rights. And this was when the New York Post was not something you used to wipe your floor, but actually was a liberal publication. And we also don't know him as he was the #1 requested speaker of the NAACP in the United States at that time, in the 1950s, and he barnstormed around the country speaking at meetings. The #2 speaker at the time was someone you might have heard of named Martin Luther King. And when the way Robinson would wrap up his speeches is he would always use this one line that people would go nuts. He would say, "If I had to choose between the Hall of Fame and full citizenship for my people, I would choose full citizenship time and again." And that to me is like almost like instinctually like the best tradition of the left in this country. Like when former labor leader and Socialist Party candidate Eugene Debs would say, "When I rise, it's going to be with the ranks, not from the ranks." That's what I hear in Robinson's words, and I think it's incredible. We may know, for example, about the famed Black Power salute of Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the 1968 Olympics. I mean, you can go outside probably and buy it on a T-shirt. I mean, it's even being commemorated last month. It was commemorated in a statue in California. But there's a lot about that picture we don't know. I mean, it's one of the most marketed pictures, certainly, in the last 100 years. But we don't know that Tommy Smith and John Carlos, they also wore beads on the medal stand to protest lynching. They didn't wear shoes because they wanted to protest poverty. That John Carlos actually wore his Olympic jacket open, which was a massive breach of etiquette at the time. That shocked them almost as much as the fist thing. And when I got to interview John Carlos for the book, and when I asked him why he left his jacket open, he said, quote, "I wanted it open because I wanted to represent shift workers, blue-collar people, and the underdogs, the people whose contributions to society are so important but don't get recognized." And we certainly don't hear about the instances that were occurring around these guys in 1968 that led to that moment. You know, the assassination of Dr. King and how it influenced those guys to make a stand at the Olympics. You know, the strikes in May in Paris, the movement that was occurring in South Africa at the time against apartheid, which was very influential to Smith and Carlos. And of course, the assassination of 500 students and workers in Mexico City right before the Olympics by the state police as they attempted to make Mexico City safe for the Olympic Games. And so we see the picture, but we don't hear any of the history, which to me is the equivalent of like telling the story of the Titanic and forgetting the iceberg. I mean, it's bad history, it's bad politics, and it's I think generally bad writing as well, to put it bluntly. Okay. I mean, can I get some water, possibly? Oh, we got a person on crutches. I'll get my own water. This book about like the underdog and whatnot. I'm like, "Hey, you on the crutches, get me some water." That would be terrible. I mean, moving on. We may know about Billie Jean King's Battle of the Sexes match against Bobby Riggs, one of the most watched television programs in the history of this country. But whenever they do retrospectives of that, we don't hear about how deeply embedded that match was at the time with the movement for women's liberation, especially one of the most enduring victories of that movement, and that's Title IX. Legislation which ensured equal funding, even though it's largely unenforced, but still an incredible victory that allows women equal funding, not just for sports. It's commonly thought of as just a sports thing, but also educational opportunities in general. I think we need to know this history because it's a living history, and it's alive anytime athletes today attempt to use their hyper-exalted, commercialized platform to speak out on social issues or draw inspiration from struggles in the streets. This history is alive when Carlos Delgado, who's a slugger for the Florida Marlins, when he was playing for the Toronto Blue Jays last year, said he wouldn't stand on the steps for the American flag because the war in Iraq was, quote-unquote, murder based upon lies. It's alive when the NBA's Etan Thomas, who plays for the Washington Wizards, shows up at anti-death penalty events in D.C. to read his slam poetry that calls out the racism of this system in utterly stark terms. And people should check out his book of poetry called More Than an Athlete, which will absolutely blow your mind. It's alive when Felipe Alou, who's the manager of the San Francisco Giants, stands up to the anti-immigrant racism on sports radio and does it proudly. And I think it's especially alive when the U.S. Congress in their steroid hysteria hoopla, you know, kind of like like Joe McCarthy's like little cousin stuff, you know, it's ridiculous, feared calling Barry Bonds to testify on steroids out of concern that he would say to them what he'd been saying to reporters, namely, quote, "Why is steroids cheating, but making a shirt in Korea for 50 cents and selling it here for $150 isn't?" Now, knowing this history positions us to support and embrace not just the athletes who go out on a political limb, but also fans who thrill to their exploits. And I think by confronting these messages that are pumped out through our play, we can dissect what we like and what we dislike about sports, and then challenge not only sports, but also our society to change. I mean, when warplanes fly overhead, as they do before Baltimore Ravens games in my neck of the woods, we can actually ask how many physical education classes are cut to pay for every Blue Angel. When those disgustingly sexist beer commercials trade on women's oppression for the high cause of selling beer, we can make clear that this kind of stuff has no place in sports. When college athletes are just massacred in the media for taking under-the-table payoffs, we can ask about like whose blood, sweat, and tears actually paid for that new Enormodome on that campus. When announcers on Fox become like as aghast as like Southern belles when they see a touchdown dance get too raunchy, I mean, we can ask how a network that pays Bill O'Reilly millions and promotes shows like Who's Your Daddy and The Littlest Groom, which is I don't even want to say what that's about, but it's kind of gross. But how they have the right to be the purity police. When our cities, like this city, are attempted to be soaked by sleazy stadium deals, like the Rat House by Bruce Ratner that he's trying to build in Brooklyn, we can stand up as sports fans and say, hey, we may love baseball, we may love basketball, it might be nice to have the Nets in town, what have you, but I'm not going to give a billionaire a $350 million present for the privilege of watching it. Now, by speaking out for the political soul of the sports we love, we do more than just build a fighting left that stands for social justice in every arena. We also begin to impose our own ideas on the world of sports, a counter-morality to compete with the yawning hypocrisy of the pro leagues. And to me, this is a morality that allows us to thrill to Barry Bonds, to not give up sports just because they soak it with their ideas, to thrill to Michael Vick, to thrill to Mia Hamm kicking a soccer ball. But unlike the mainstream sports jabber, it's a morality that actually recognizes these athletes as human beings with minds as well as bodies, not just as extensions of equipment. I think it needs to understand that the incentive of athletes to speak out for social justice lies not in their individual brilliance, but in our ability to build a struggle outside the arena. In other words, if we want more Muhammad Ali's, more John Carlos's, and more Billie Jean King's, if we want to see a gay male athlete have the courage to risk his neck by coming out, instead of players like Mike Piazza calling press conferences just to let us all know that he's not gay, I think that's going to take building a broader movement for social justice outside the arena so our heroes will have people to look up to. And in that fight, we need every drop of history we can get our hands on. As Tommy Smith himself said about his famed Black Power salute, this is what Tommy Smith said. He said, quote, "It's not something I could lay on my shelf and forget about. My heart and soul are still on that team, and I still believe in everything we were trying to fight for in 1968. It has not been resolved, and it's going to be part of our future." I mean, he's absolutely right. Struggle is part of our future, and when that struggle occurs, it will affect, and is affecting right now, athletes and fans alike. What the book is about at the end of the day is about knowing that those who speak out actually stand in a tradition that goes back 100 years, and that speaks to actually beyond the field of play to all of us. It's a tradition that stands in the broader fight for social justice. It's a tradition we should embrace, whether we're sports fans or not. Thank you. Okay, we're taking questions. I'll remind people that we're on TV. wait for the mic. Makeup's in the back if people want to. No, just kidding. Just raise your hand.
I've been mulling on this question for about 10 years, so I'm happy.
Geez.
I've been really looking forward to being here.
I can't think of a better place for you to ask than on television.
I read your article in the International Socialist Review about the Jack Johnson riots, and so I remember in 1992 when I was a freshman in high school, when the Chicago Bulls first won the NBA championship. I remember just seeing on TV, the Rodney King trial verdict had just happened. There had just been the rebellion in Los Angeles. So I remember seeing on TV that after the Bulls won, fans rushed to the VIP end of the stadium, because I think the Chicago Stadium's on the poor side of town. They were, assaulting the limousines and all the important people. They were burning police cars. It was. There was a little rebellion going on. And so basically my question is, and I've tried since the advent of the internet to look this up. And I just basically wanted to ask about, given the fact that the Chicago police are racist and brutal, what is it about that allows these little opportunities for people to fight back in such a, a victorious way, where they won, they drove the cops away. And do you know of anything else, in world sports history even, where there was some political, advance after a sports victory or defeat?
As far as world sports, do sports take place outside the United States? I'm sorry, I'm born and raised in this country, so I've never heard of these other sports. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to take the pro-sports riot stance as a mode for social change, but just to say that when sports riots do occur, I do think that obviously, you don't go out and burn a limousine if you're feeling really good about your life and your options and what's going on in the world. So I think that they are largely, if not entirely, expressions of alienation. Whether they occur on college campuses or occur in cities, that doesn't mean necessarily even that they're politically progressive in any way. I think they're expressions, though. It's not a good thing. I had somebody once at a meeting asked me, hey, I was at Syracuse University and there was this riot after we won the championship. How do we channel that into the movement against the war? And it's well, you don't. In some respect, it's an expression of people's utter sort of disconnection from politics, not an expression of their connection. It's more like an outgrowth of just anger and frustration that people feel, not an expression of I think even something positive that we can organize. I think the Jack Johnson thing is different because it was the character of people defending their neighborhoods against white lynch mobs and feeling the confidence to do that in the context of what Jack Johnson represented against a great white hope. So I think there's a qualitative difference there than some guys lighting their mattress on fire in their frat house and throwing it out in the street. Not that I don't want to talk to those guys, but just when they're not drunk.
Yes, I have several questions. Let's talk about the Olympics first. I don't know if you mentioned in the book, I'm in the middle of reading the book right now, but I think Juan Samraj, I think is the right pronunciation, was the head of the International Olympic Committee. I don't know if you brought this out, but he was a former, education or physical director for Francisco Franco. And I was wondering if you know the historical background behind that and how he impacted on the Olympics. And I don't know whether or not you talked about the situation in the Berlin Olympics in 1936 where the Jewish athletes, Marty Glickman, I believe was one of them, that were excluded from the Olympics, participating in the 36 Berlin Olympics because they were Jewish. Yeah. And whether or not you had included that in the book itself. The other question I had was a transformation, a metamorphosis of George Foreman, because I remember when growing up watching George Foreman, I was a young kid then, that back in the 75, he was really quiet and was really closed and didn't say very much, whereas Ali was really boisterous. And it's like a complete metamorphosis, and George Foreman's really loud. And have you talked about that and what the basis of that transformation? Of course, Ali, we know it because of his disease and because he took too many punches probably. But I want to make a comment on that. And one last thing is about, did you monitor your book back in the 70s called In Your Face? I don't know if you remember that book. It was a book that was a sports book that talked about the issues that you very similar to that at that period of time.
Wow. first about the Olympics and Juan Antonio Samaranch, whose name you pronounce just fine. I mean, he was the head for a long time of the International Olympic Committee, the IOC. Now, the IOC, throughout their history in the last 100 years, I mean, had more fascists sitting around the table than like your typical outtakes of the Nuremberg trials. I mean, it was an outrageous motley crew of people who supported Franco's Spain and Hitler. I mean, it's like, find me a fascist, these guys were. I mean, they followed him around like groupies would follow the Grateful Dead. I mean, these guys are pretty outrageous. And it actually connects very well with like kind of the history of the Olympics. So the modern Olympics started in 1898, which was also the year of the Spanish-American War in this country. And I mean, it had to do with actually organizing the divisions of the world through games. I mean, representing what was happening in the broader sense in the world. And I do talk about that in the book. But no, the modern Olympic movement, it's kind of a contradictory thing, because it's like, on the one hand, you actually do get to see sports that are utterly marginalized in the other time. It's like, I like watching those sports. I like not having to watch, you know, the same thing all the time. And a lot of in a lot of those sports, I think there's just incredible beauty, and it's wonderful, really. I mean, the way in the state of Maryland, the way it really did come alive around like Michael Phelps, the swimmer, and all of a sudden people are talking about swimming, and that to me is interesting. And learning stuff, and it's different. Especially women's sports get a profile in the Olympics they don't get other times. But the Olympics itself, as a quote-unquote movement, and they talk about the Olympic movement, I would argue is utterly barbaric and reactionary in every way, shape, or form. And if you want proof of that, you raised one example, which to me is the tip of the iceberg, and that's the '36 Olympics in Berlin. The history of when the Olympics actually go to a place and what they do to a place in terms of organizing a city is about crushing a municipality and actually crushing the people who actually live in a given city. And people in New York, you guys should give yourselves a hand for warding off the 2012 Olympics. You did very well for yourself. And just the last thing, I'm sorry, to say about that is one of the reasons why you guys didn't get the Olympics is because they were flooded with emails and phone calls from people in New York City saying, please do not send us the Olympics, because people here had some sense of actually what that means for ordinary people. There's a whole history about that which we can talk about. Foreman, I'm not going to talk about. Other people have questions. I'm sorry I'm going on too long. I have a lot about Foreman in the book because I got to interview him, which was really cool, especially when he started singing Bob Dylan to me over the phone, that Everybody Must Get Stoned song. He started singing that over the phone. And then he said, you know what that song's about? And I'm like, I don't know, what drugs? And he's like, no, it's about, you know, when people throw stones at you when you make a stand. And I was like, I don't know, George, I think it's about drugs. I mean, you should go get stoned. I mean, I don't know. Sorry.
Dave, I'm wondering if there was a pivot point that got the sports labor movement started, and if you can tell us if the American labor movement can learn anything from the pro-sports labor movement.
I mean, yeah, first, it's an understanding that sports unions, I would argue, are part of the labor movement, which is kind of a difficult argument sometimes because you have some athletes like Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, who are part owners of teams, and I don't care how good your union is, if you're a steel worker, you're not going to own a string of steel mills at the end of the day. So it's highly distorted. It's different. You know, players organize individual contracts. But the whole reason why players make their super salaries is actually because of the fact that there was a union movement in sports, particularly in the 1960s. And the pivot for that was really two events. And I talk about it extensively in the book. I have a whole chapter on it. One was the hiring of Marvin Miller, who was a steelworkers union organizer. And I got to interview Marvin Miller for the book. And he brought a different kind of approach to organizing baseball players, who at the time, baseball players, what they made in a year, average salary in the mid-60s for a baseball player was like low 20,000 at that point. I mean, every player, unless you were like Mickey Mantle, basically, you worked in the off-season. I interviewed older players. I mean, they worked in quarries in the off-season, like crushing rocks. It's hard to imagine Alex Rodriguez going to the quarry. You know, but that's what the conditions were like at the time. And they won that bigger piece of the pie through active struggle and solidarity. And the pivot for that was Marvin Miller and his relationship with Curt Flood, which I talk about in the book. Curt Flood was a different kind of player who represented a lot of people in that he came from Oakland, which means he came from a city, and he was African American growing up in Oakland. So it's like that was different for the major leagues in the 60s, because at the time there was still a small minority of black players, and the ones who were there tended to come from very small towns in the South, very isolated, very atomized. Here you had Curt Flood coming in representing a lot of players who were new at that time, coming in and having to play like in the southern minor leagues, and people would be calling him boy and asking him to eat on the bus and, you know, all that stuff, and he would be like, who are you talking to? You know, I'm from Oakland, I will kill you. You know, and he's just like, you know, it's just a very different kind of attitude that he brought to it. That was, and so what he did was, him and Marvin Miller, the genius of Marvin Miller was he got that the labor movement, and I think a lot of labor leaders today need to see this, does not exist in a vacuum. He got that black workers were becoming radicalized. He talked with Curt Flood about how to actually use that to push forward, and even though Curt Flood, I mean, his story ends up being a tragic one, but he fought to end the reserve clause, which was really the trigger for the salaries spiraling upward to where we are today. And what I agree with, what I take from it all, is what one major league player about Alex Rodriguez, they said about him, if Alex Rodriguez has a soul, he'll send 10% of his paycheck to Curt Flood's family.
Dave, is there any truth to the rumor that you were on steroids when you wrote this book? That's not really my question.
Okay.
Could you talk about the way the sports world and then the ensuing madness in the media co-opted Pat Tillman's move from pro football into the U.S. military?
So I'll just say the person who asked that question is a writer named Mickey Z, who's one of the best writers out there. If you've never heard of him, you should get his stuff. I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that. He's an incredible, incredible writer. To answer the first question, though, if I am taking steroids, there's a doctor who's going to get sued pretty damn quick, I'll tell you that. The second part, though, the Pat Tillman story is to me like almost overwhelmingly tragic, and it's one that I think is worth reviving and talking about, especially given what Cindy Sheehan is doing right now in Texas. I mean, Cindy... I mean, it's one of those things where you say never let anybody tell you that one person can't make a difference. I mean, if they're willing to actually get out there and put themselves on the line. And, I mean, the connection with Cindy Sheehan has to do with Pat Tillman's parents. People know the story of Pat Tillman. I'm going to assume they do. He's turned down millions of dollars in the NFL. He joined the Army Rangers. We got the big nationally, he was killed in Afghanistan. There was a nationally televised funeral that John McCain and other quote-unquote political luminaries spoke at. Bush even spoke on the Jumbotron at the Arizona Stadium where he played during the election season to address the fans as everybody cheered and they flew the Blue Angels, USA, USA. The only problem with it was that it was a total, unequivocal, and disgusting lie, because Pat Tillman actually died at the hands of his own troops, and how that occurred is still something that's very unknown, and because they burned all the evidence at the time claiming that it was a biohazard, which is actually not true. I looked it up because I had all these people email me after I wrote about it saying, you don't understand military law, man. They had to burn the evidence. I was like, great. You know, love the laptop commandos, like with their, you know. But what makes the story so just like relentlessly disgusting was the fact that Pat Tillman's parents were not told that he died in this matter. Pat Tillman's brother, who was in his platoon, who he went to the Rangers with, was not told. And they were left at the funeral basically being used as props. So people ask, what did Pat Tillman actually die for? I mean, in the literal sense, he died for PR for this war. And it's also not a coincidence at all that they needed to sell his death as heroic because it came out the same week as Abu Ghraib and the scandal there. They needed that story. They needed a hero, and they needed someone in Pat Tillman who couldn't turn them down as he did when he was a live soldier and say, I'm not going to do your ads, I just want to be a soldier, whatever. You know, whether you agree or disagree with what Pat Tillman did, the point is that they ruthlessly exploited him in death. And his parents, Pat and Mary Sr., after they heard this, they're both known very quiet people, very conservative people. They're divorced couple. They spoke out jointly about this. They condemned Bush. They condemned the war. They condemned just the entire charade that their family was put through. And then they immediately got quiet again. I was really hoping that they would use that as an opportunity. But two things happened that I thought were a shame. One was that because this story really did get relegated to the sports section, You didn't see, like, the anti-war movement, the left, actually go to the Tillmans and be like, let's get your story out there. Let's talk about it because it exposes how sick this system is, which is something I would argue should have happened. And the second thing, but what I'm hoping now is, like, with what Cindy Sheehan is doing, that it's going to give confidence and courage, not just to the Tillmans, but to everybody who's lost a family member in this disgusting war, and that includes Iraqis as well, to actually get out there and have their story heard. One more question.
I wanted to ask you about, say something about John Roberts for a second, because one of the things that this moderate, apparently, a very palatable Supreme Court justice has talked about is being against Title IX. And just, I was wondering if you could just talk for a minute about, like, what Title IX has actually meant in this nation for women's sports, and, like, what, and maybe what it would look like if something like that was opposed.
Yeah, I mean, first, just to, Title IX, it speaks to me. I have a 12-month-year-old daughter right now, so it's like when I hear about them overturning Title IX, doing women's rights work was one of the first political things I ever did in college, but now that I have a daughter, I'm just kind of like, oh, this shit just got personal. What are you doing? Because before Title IX was enacted, roughly let me put it this way. Right now, 1 out of every 3 women/girls in the United States take part in sports on the junior high or high school level. 1 out of 3. Before Title IX, it was 1 out of 27. I mean, you are talking about a radical difference in the lives of women because of this legislation. And if you look at it statistically, issues about with regards to self-esteem, likelihood of being in an abusive relationship, likelihood of having an eating disorder, these things can be connected with sports. And this, to me, with all that's disgusting about sports, speaks to what's good about sports, because obviously people are getting something productive out of it that does something positive for them in their lives if it can produce those results. And this is what John Roberts wants to destroy. And actually what George Bush wants to destroy as well. Now, why do they want to destroy it? I think they want to destroy it not because they dislike watching the UConn women's hoops team. I think they want to destroy it for the same reason that they want to overturn Roe versus Wade. I think they want to destroy it for the same reason that they're actually trying to roll back everything that a previous generation, Ali's generation, won in the streets. And I think for that reason alone it's worth fighting for, but it's also worth fighting for because it represents an attack on all of us. Nobody benefits on this, and they tried out all this garbage about it, about, it's just funding teams that don't need to be there. Look at the men's crew team. They had to be, eliminated. Look at the men's wrestling team. Just 2 facts for people to leave here with. One is that the #1 budget eater in all of college sports is football. Men's football. The budget for men's football destroys athletic budgets. And men's football is like a lottery. If you roll out a team and you happen to go 11-1, you are going to make millions and millions and millions. If you roll out a team and you're 4-7, you just created a sieve and your budget is destroyed. And they invest in the chance of reaping that kind of money. That's one thing. The second thing is that there is no record anywhere, anytime in history, of a women's team being funded, them rolling out the balls, the coach comes out with the whistle, and nobody shows up. That's never happened. It shows time and again, if you give women the opportunity to actually practice athletic arts, practice that kind of freedom of expression with sports, they will grab that time and again. I get a wrap up. This is great. My child needs shoes. No, just kidding. I'll just say really quickly, the most rewarding thing about doing this book by a mile has been people who've come up to me and said, like, hey, I was never able to have a political discussion with my dad before, or with my daughter before, or with my son before, but I gave them this book and they actually read it. And now now they're like, hey, I didn't know this about Ali. I didn't know this about Billie Jean King. And then all of a sudden I realize I'm talking about civil rights with my dad. I'm talking about anti-racism with my dad. And it's like, if you can use sports as a way to actually talk to people, because I think we live in a country where politics is a dirty word. It's a bad thing at my job if you're political. to be political. And I think that's because people view politics as what the two ugly white guys with the bad haircuts do on C-SPAN, and not politics as what we live and breathe every single day. And that is politics. Politics are in art, politics are in culture, and politics are in sports. And we should not walk away from that political arena. We should jump in it with 2 feet, have out the fights, and get a new generation of people pissed off at the system, and get them to not burn up the cars after Syracuse wins the championship, but go out there and raise some hell about this war and about this world. Thank you.
Dave Zirin is a writer for The Source magazine and a senior writer for Basketball.com. What's My Name, Fool? Is published by Haymarket Books. For more information, visit haymarketbooks.org.